Susie. So how are you all? Yeah. Excellent. Did you have a good breakfast this morning? Yes. Energetic? Yeah. He is. The rest of you are catching up, right? That's it. Now, my name is Matthew Griffin, and I must admit, when it comes to presentations, you might hate me because I never recycle a presentation. All my presentations are fresh out the gate. So, in this presentation called Recycling the Future, because actually I think it's kind of an appropriate title, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you new recycling technologies. I'm going to be showing you how the future of recycling as an industry is adapting and needs to adapt basically to current, shall we say, world realities. And then I'm going to be taking you on a tour basically of a variety of emerging technologies that maybe you think have nothing really to do with recycling, but actually could be the very future of recycling, certainly in quite a lot of different categories and domains. So this is my agenda. So I'm going to be going through a little bit of the Future Foundation, a world view, because as Susie says, we cannot ignore the world view. There are benefits and there are detractors. Have a look at the circular economy, new markets, universal innovations. So when I talk about universal innovations, there are quite a lot of what we call general purpose technologies that apply to whatever you are recycling, whether it's metals, plastics, fabrics, and so on and so forth. Then I'm going to have a look at recycling's big three. So this is really where I'm going to have a look at a very high level at the three main methods of recycling and how they're actually changing, irrespective, again, of kind of what you're recycling, and then scrap metal recycling. Now, when we have a look at the future, I come very regularly, basically, to the UAE and to the Middle East. I talk on almost every technology. I talk almost on every sector. And I sit down very regularly, basically, with governments around the world to help them develop their green policies. I sit down with the vast majority of global manufacturers to actually help them understand how they're going to make their products in the future. And I'll show you some of those. And that's whether that's aircraft, whether it's cars, and so on and so forth. And I also basically work with a huge number of different charitable trusts. So when we actually have a look at the future today, 75% of people are actually apprehensive about the future. And the main reason for that is because we often talk in terms of things like climate crisis. There are a lot of people around the world that I talk to that don't think capitalism works, for example. But actually, when we have a look at capitalism alone, the vast majority of younger generations feel that today it's responsible for treating workers like commodities and the planet like a commodity. And to a degree, basically, they're right. Traditional capitalism does mean that we strip mine the earth, we take that out, and we make products with that, and off we go. But when we have a look at the future, there are a huge number of megatrends. There are about 250 megatrends that I follow, and there are 600 exponential technologies, not just AI. And when we have a look just at the technologies, for example, I work all the way upstream. These are 170 emerging technologies that will change not only what we make, but how we make it. So I'll be touching on some of these because some of these actually have a significant impact on what you do, what you recycle, the markets you're in. So for example, we have 3D printing. We have BIR, which is transforming the global manufacturing industry as we speak. I'll touch on that. We've got bioreactors, which ironically, as a recycler, if you're not using a bioreactor today, you might actually be using one tomorrow. And then when we have a look at biotech, traditionally the recycling industry has not really had much in common with biotech. But increasingly, certainly one part of your industry is going to potentially be intrinsically linked to developments in biotech. And I'll explore that with you in a later bit. Then we've got connectivity, new electronics. When we have a look at how we make electronics, that's changing. We're starting to see the rise of polymer electronics. We're even starting to see the rise of plastic computer chips. When we have a look at energy, I'll dive into energy a bit, because energy is an opportunity, but it's also a battleground, especially when we have a look at things like carbon taxes, emissions, and so on and so forth. Artificial intelligence, new materials. Very few people, when I'm talking about the future, look at the future of materials. But if you think about all of the concrete, basically, that you end up having to recycle, or the rebar that you have to recycle, a number of my clients over in the United States now use plastics and something called lavacrete to build buildings. In Dubai, I'm working with the UAE government to 3D print an 11-story skyscraper, but it won't be made out of concrete, and it won't necessarily have rebar in it. I work with aluminium smelters out of India, and increasingly we're talking about using aluminium as the rebar, because when concrete cracks, the rebar gets wet, it expands, it blows up. And 80% of all infrastructure costs are on maintenance. So increasingly we're looking at new ways to put aluminium into concrete, for example. And then we have robotics, another key area for the recycling industry, and I'll touch on those. And then we've got some other stuff, right? But you can already hopefully gauge there's a lot to talk about. Now, when we have a look at the world view, because we cannot ignore the world view, increasingly we're living in a bifurcating world. So the world is starting to split a little bit in two, along cultural, economic, and political lines. Now, that brings tension. And that tension basically is both upsetting you in terms of an industry, it's disrupting material flows and so on and so forth, but it's also creating brand new opportunities, and I'll go into that in a bit. We've got the BRICS realignment, so increasingly we see Saudi Arabia, for example, coming into the BRICS, and we actually see new trade partnerships being created in the BRICS, which affect where you build your plants, government policies, and so on and so forth. We see fragile government. So if we have a look at the United States, for example, the Democrats come in and will say, we care about the environment, we should recycle more, we should chase renewable electricity and energy, and so on and so forth. And then the other party in the House invariably comes in and says, what they said, we're going to do the opposite. So from a regulatory perspective, you see this flip-flopping. From a grant perspective, from a tax break perspective, fragile government increasingly means that, do you invest in the country or do you not invest in the country? Do you get a tax break if you invest in the country? Do you not get a tax break in the country? So it brings in uncertainty into the industry. Resource scarcity. This, I think, is really your opportunity. Take the others as well. But increasingly, we are living in a world where we are resource scarce. This applies to standard things such as oil and wood, but it also applies to nickel, cobalt, lithium. It's estimated at the current rate, basically, we can run out of lithium in 10 years. We're also running out of rare earth metals and all sorts of bits. So resource scarcity, in my opinion, is the message that you should hammer home. And the reason for that is because I sit down with the prime ministers and the ministers of different governments, and whether it is food, whether it is metals, whatever it happens to be, this is pretty much a number one government priority. Resource scarcity and resource protection. And I'll show you what governments are doing about that as well. And then we have strategic dislocation, where because we have a kind of bifurcating world, we see many, many different multinational organizations moving their supply chains. For example, we see some outflows basically from China, and we see it into India, and we see it into Vietnam, and so on and so forth. So again, when we're having a look at where your raw materials come from, where your consumer bases are, that's changing. And then, for example, when we actually have a look at Asia, it's estimated that by 2030, we will have 600 million more middle-class people. And the richer that you are, generally the more resource or more stuff you buy or consume. So we see these swings. Now, every year, so I do a lot of work with the United Nations. I'm going to be back in next time I'm in Abu Dhabi, I'm going to be talking at COP28. Now, every year we use approximately 100 billion tons of global resource. Wood, metals, materials, whatever it happens to be. 2.4 billion of that goes direct to, well, it's waste. And we know it's not waste, we know it's the seventh resource. We know that waste is actually resource. And I think there's another communications message to be posted out there. But either way, today we're producing 2.4 billion tons of waste. Now by 2040, this grows to about 3.2 billion tons. And I think those estimates are correct. They might even be slightly under-egged. However, when we have a look at recycling, the recycling of hard waste, we estimate, and this is the irony, we estimate that we're recycling about 312 million tons of hard waste. And the reason I say it's an irony is because there are so many statistics that can tell me how much waste we are producing, but when it comes to how much we are recycling, you have to really, really dig in, explore, and look. And realistically, I think this is almost wrong. We should know exactly how much we're recycling globally and maybe have a bit of a guess at the total waste, because we know the waste is a big figure. But 312 million tons of hard waste resource is recycled. Your problem is obviously not source material, which kind of brings us to a variety of different topics. Now, we're also seeing, the reason why I say resource scarcity is I think your number one opportunity, tentatively, is resource weaponization. So increasingly, we're seeing various countries ban the exports of rare earth metals, graphene. We're seeing restrictions on the export of lithium and cobalt and nickel. We're seeing steel being weaponized with trade tariffs. So increasingly, the governments of the world are starting to weaponize resources and say, if you want our resources, then you either can't have it or you've got to pay more. And this is actually concerning around the world. Whether I travel to Latin America, whether I travel to Europe, whether I travel to America, or whether I travel to Asia, this is concerning governments everywhere. But that's kind of a good thing, because if they can't get access to resources from one area, they will give you tax incentives to find new ways to extract or recycle the waste and the resource that they have in country. An example of this is the battle for rare earth elements, uncommon metals, even graphene. Because as we see, for example, export restrictions for gallium, we now have a lot of developed nations saying, well, we need gallium to produce semiconductors and so on and so forth. They are screaming about this. So when we actually have a look at the battle for rare earth elements, this is a recycling hot topic, because if I can't get them from China or wherever I am, I've got to find somewhere else to get them from. And there's a lot of rare earth elements, let's face it, in e-waste and lots of other places. Even potash has rare earth. Now I've got a bad back. That's why the funny noise. So this is the other trend that I see globally. Governments, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's South Africa, are saying, if resources are becoming scarce, whether it's rice, whether it's grain, whether it's other resources, what I'm seeing is countries saying, in order to secure our supply of lithium, whatever it happens to be, we will pay top rate. So I'm seeing, especially developed nations, securing resources at premium prices because they can, and because those resources are crucial to the successful functioning of their economies. Now, when we have a look at lithium-ion batteries, for example, in electric vehicles as well as grid-scale storage, we see huge numbers of lithium-ion batteries being produced. We see huge numbers of plants, recycling plants being developed. However, lithium and cobalt are precious commodities now. We can extract them in Saudi Arabia from seawater, and we're doing that with Saudi Arabia's desalination plants. However, in the US, in Europe, and in Japan, we now have programs and projects to replace the metals in lithium-ion batteries. And we are replacing them with organic compounds, polymers, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, because we see that lithium is an increasingly scarce resource that we're going to pay a premium for, we're trying to take it out of the batteries altogether. Companies like Tesla and Panasonic are already doing this, and we're fairly well along. But it'll take about 10 years to feed into the commercial EV market. We're also seeing wild cards. We see waste import bans. We saw that with China, where they suddenly banned the import of particular plastic waste. But also the CMA lines last year banned the transport of plastics on their cargo ships. And the CMA lines transport about 11 million tons of plastics around the world. And the reason why they banned it is they said, we do not want to be responsible for transporting plastic from one country to another country where we don't know whether or not that country has the processing capability to recycle that. In other words, the CMA line's president said, we don't want to be taking plastics from one country and putting them into another country where they might just end up in landfill or polluting the environment or whatever it happens to be. So I do a lot of work with Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk and Costco, and there are rumblings generally. Now, when we have a look at the circular economy, consumption. We've been educating people for years that the planet basically is not a waste ground. It shouldn't just be a future landfill site. And yet, despite all of the education efforts that we have, we're recycling 312 million tons. I don't think there is a single consumer on the planet that doesn't know that they should be recycling different products for whether it's environmental reasons or whether it's just because they shouldn't. And yet, fundamentally, if we cannot get people to use recycling bins properly, or recycle whatever products they have properly, you never see the material. In Europe, it's estimated that about 15% of plastic is recycled, about 65% of metals are recycled. This is your biggest opportunity, but you know that. But you also know that there's plenty of resource to recycle. Now, some of the companies that I work with are the construction companies like Colas and Arup. And increasingly, there is this big opportunity, which I know you guys are doing already, to actually work hand in glove with different industries. So, for example, with Arup, when Arup now build a new airport, they tag all of the materials and all of the different assets in that airport. So they can literally scan an airport and say, this airport is made up of this type of concrete, this with this value, this amount of rebar. And so what Arup are trying to do is they're trying to make it easier for you to identify the materials that are coming into your depots and then recycle and separate them. And this is sort of why it's not a single industry initiative, it's a whole industry initiative. And we do this using Internet of Things and Web3 technologies and so on and so forth, so that when you get materials into the plants, you know exactly what you've got, the compounds it was made with, the exact grades. When we have a look at government intervention, we've seen the development, obviously, of net zero and zero waste. There are only a very few couple of companies that actually have zero waste policies. Why? Because it's hard. If you have a look at plastics alone, there are about, 170 different plastics, 12 different categories. Creating a zero waste company is hard, which then means there's always going to be stuff to be recycled. We see the use of indirect taxation as a tool. Government sees indirect taxes as a way to try to change industry and consumer behavior. And it's effective. We saw this with plastic bags. In the UK, when we introduced a plastic bag tax of just 5 pence, 96% of the plastic bags disappeared. And we see this repeated throughout every continent on the planet. So governments basically have the opportunity to use indirect taxation as a weapon. But increasingly, the amount of public debt that governments have, they now have double the amount of public debt that they did before COVID. Increasingly, with companies like Ernst & Young, KPMG, we increasingly believe that governments will keep using indirect taxation as a way to fill up their coffers. And then the question is, do they tax sugar or plastic? And increasingly, for example, in the EU, we see more plastic indirect taxes coming through. Now, when we have a look at the EU specifically, they've just announced this, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. Now, why this is important is because originally the European Union would say, for example, say to a plastics manufacturer, if you're setting up shop in Germany, then you need to be able to produce plastic in an environmentally responsible and friendly way, okay? In other words, don't pollute. However, with some companies would say, okay, that's fine, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to make our plants as green as possible. But others would just say, that's fine, I'm just going to go to Vietnam, where they don't have a carbon tax or a pollution tax. And so now the European Union CBAM policy means that anyone who is importing, say for example, plastics or metals from another country, but those materials have generated a huge amount of emissions, when the steel comes across the border, the European Union will say, but this steel, for every ton of steel you produced 2 tons of carbon dioxide. So we're going to tax you. So now the EU CBAM initiative has found a way to actually help companies decarbonize or force companies to decarbonize even if they aren't in the EU. But the flip side of this means that decarbonizing, for example, smelting industries can take decades, which then means that the amount of metal recycling in the European Union will only increase, because increasingly recycled metal and green steel, like we see with Volvo, for example, will increasingly not attract any new taxation. So CBAM is a little bit of a sleeping dog that will change inflows. And of course, when we try to change not the recycling industry, but consumer behaviors, in the United States alone, when people put plastic bag taxes on the table, for example, in the US, lobbyists are spending $4.1 billion every year to try to change government policy back in their favor. We've seen this with plastics. We tried to ban plastics in particular parts of Texas, and the lobbyists got involved. And I won't name who, but you can look them up. You probably know who they are. But big oil likes a bit of lobbying. Now, when we have a look at design and manufacture, the circular economy takes waste as a failure. So when we have a look at investors, because investors pull the strings. When we have a look at ESG investing, I work with companies like UBS, Citi, Legal & General, BlackRock, and so on and so forth. If you cannot prove that your company is green, particularly the E in ESG, then we will sell your shares and dump you out of our portfolio. Companies don't like that. So we now see $50 trillion worth of assets that are green assets. That represents well over a third of the global asset pool. So investors are actually on your side because they are going to their portfolio companies and saying, if you do not take the environment, shall we say, seriously, or sustainability seriously, we will dump your stock. Which then means that companies are more inclined to come to you and say, we need to be sustainable, so we're going to look at scope 1, scope 2 emissions and everything else, but how could we actually work with you as an industry to be more sustainable, to embrace the circular economy? One of those companies is BMW. This is the iCircular. It's a completely new kind of car, designed to be fully recycled. But you just melt it apart. There's no rivets. If you have a look at the badges, even the badges are etched. So there are companies that are trying to move the dial. When we have a look at generative design, artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to design products. AI is being used to design rocket engines with companies like Hyperganic in Germany. Now, if you wanted to recycle this, it's a 3D printed rocket engine made out of one material. But because it's 3D printed, it uses 70% less resource, less metal than traditional rocket engines. The Under Armour sneaker, designed by artificial intelligence in 2 hours, 3D printed. This collapses global supply chains. Adidas are doing this as well. Adidas now 3D print more shoes in the back of their stores because they don't need to make 100 million pairs of shoes in China and then send 60 million pairs of shoes to landfill or to the you guys when those shoes don't sell. So now, if you order a sneaker, we just 3D print it on demand. And then companies like General Motors are using artificial intelligence to reduce the weight, the amount of material that is used to produce their vehicles by at least 50 pounds. So when we have a look at the use of artificial intelligence, what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop new products faster, but using less material. So we start reducing that inbound waste stream. The other thing that we're seeing happen, for example, with companies like Volkswagen, BMW again, is what we call flattening the supply chain. Now, we've all seen supply chain crunches. We know basically that supply chains post-COVID snarled up. So supply chain resilience is incredibly important to companies around the world. And one of the things that we can do is a traditional combustion engine vehicle has 30,000 components. But by designing these vehicles in new ways, we can reduce the number of components down to about 10,000, which then means basically our supply chain is more resilient. We're using less material again. And when we have a look at electric vehicles, for example, electric vehicles use even fewer parts. So flattening supply chains, whether it's in the automotive industry, the airline industry, or just the general industry, is increasingly a topic. When we have a look at material innovation, we have quick release binders. So if you're recycling lithium-ion batteries, we have university researchers who are now developing new binders. So when you try to recycle lithium-ion batteries, those batteries just literally fall apart without the need for too many toxic chemicals. When we talk about new kinds of alloys that you might need to start recycling, artificial intelligence is now developing new aluminium alloys faster than ever before. Toyota and other companies have been using AI to design new AL2000, 3000 and 7000 alloys, except the artificial intelligence has designed these new alloys in 2 weeks. So if a new alloy started emerging, how quickly could you adapt your recycling processes and plants to accommodate that new alloy? Probably not too difficult, but nevertheless something just to bear in mind. And then when we have a look at new plastics, we're making plastics from carbon dioxide, from sugars. We're making them so they're biodegradable. We're also starting to mess around basically with the monomer bonds in plastics. Because as you'll know, basically when we actually have a look at chemical recycling, you've got to spend a huge amount of energy and effort trying to break down the individual bonds between different monomers in a polymer plastic. So this is where we're using amine and trichetone, which now means that the amount of effort, the energy that you need to put into a plastic recycling system to recycle a polymer plastic has now fallen by up to 80%. And then when we have a look at new markets, there's a huge amount of material innovation going on. So fast fashion we know is a problem. We know that most clothes aren't recycled and that they're a bit annoying to recycle. So we're looking at new ways to recycle everything from polyester to cotton, natural fibers. When we have a look at wind turbines and solar panels basically are made of metals. Wind turbines basically have carbon fiber. There is a French company that keeps getting huge amounts of funding because they found a great way to recycle carbon fiber. And carbon fiber is a material of the future that is in great demand, aside from anything else. So the caps of these wind turbines are generally carbon fiber. When we have a look at the transportation industry, we're starting to use new alloys for vehicles. We're also starting to use, in Tesla's case, something called a gigapress, where the entire vehicle chassis is just punched at once, and it's one piece, not multiple parts. So the way that we construct vehicles is changing. And then, of course, we have lithium-ion batteries. Robotics. One of my clients is ABB Robotics. Their sales are going through the roof. They cannot make enough product. They have back orders for 3 years. So when we have a look at the growth of the global robotics industry, how many of the robots are you actually recycling? When we have a look at energy innovation, so whether you are looking at energy innovation to power your plants, you've got biofuels. So this is biogas, biohydrogen, but also sustainable aviation fuel. So we have new sort of hydrocarbon-based fuels. If you do use hydrocarbons, then in the EU, we can make green diesel from the carbon dioxide in the air to create hydrocarbon fuel, which you could put into your plants, which turn your plants carbon neutral overnight. You don't have to change the equipment at all. Then we've got different hydrogens and everything else. We've got renewables, hydro, geothermal, solar, wind, wireless energy. When we have a look at the electric vehicle industry, though, we're going over here. We're going beyond lithium-ion batteries already. We're looking at solid-state batteries. We're looking at polymer batteries. We're looking at batteries with bacteria in, because we can produce electricity from bacteria. When we have a look at some of the new furnace technologies, for example, the smelting and furnace technologies in the recycling industry, increasingly we're seeing ammonia now being tabled as a way to power blast furnaces or smelters. And then we've got a lot of other things, etc. But here's the rub. How much are you paying for your energy? Because I bet you're paying a lot for your energy. The cost per megawatt hour of solar is now $0.2, 20 cents per megawatt hour. So with solar, for example, it's an exponential energy. The cost of energy generation is reaching zero, whether it's here in the Middle East or whether it's in Europe. When we look at universal innovations, closed-loop processes, vertical integration, you bring the material in, you recycle it, but then you create a product off the back of it. In Saudi Arabia, we see Aramco doing this. Aramco used to take the crude oil out of the ground and sell it. Now they actually own the vertical stack. They take the crude oil out of the ground, and then they own the chemical companies to turn that into drugs, plastics, and everything else. So vertical integration actually offers you an opportunity to become manufacturers and then start supplying product that has a higher premium, bearing in mind that as more recyclers enter the market, your margins are probably going to start decreasing. It's going to be more competitive. This offers you another way, basically, to actually add a new revenue stream on top. Artificial intelligence, whether we're using it to ID, sort, optimize, figure out basically when your equipment's actually going to fail, or the quality control basically of your materials that you're producing at the end. Robotics. Robotics they are only going to get faster, and they're only going to get better. So increasingly, robotics will be good at complex processing, separating out streams. So if you think robots are a bit slow today, I mean, some of them are quick, but if you think robots are slow today, because of developments in actuators and everything else, they're going to get faster. When we have a look at machine vision, we can see the entire electromagnetic spectrum, which means basically that we can use artificial intelligence to analyze the material flow. So these technologies are multipliers. When we have a look at sensors, we've got hyperspectral sensors and quantum sensors coming through. So quantum sensors are 10 million times more sensitive than any of the sensing systems you have in your businesses today, which means that it's easier for you to identify the waste makeup in your stream. So many people kind of ignore sensors, but if you want to understand what kind of metals these are, just with one scan, that's sensors, it's AI, and it's machine vision. And then as for the big three, you've got biological. So biological recycling, I said that you were going to start loving biotech more. In biotech, we have a trend, it's in a technology called synthetic biology. At the moment, a lot of recycling processes, particularly chemical recycling processes, are very toxic. And governments don't like that. So on the one hand, governments are clamping down a little bit on toxicity. But we're now using genetically modified bacteria to create biogas, bioplastics, and oil. But also, we're now starting to use bacteria in slag heaps to recover rare earth elements. So in my opinion, if you're not looking at biological recycling, I would suggest you have a look at it. Because we are rewriting nature in unprecedented ways. We make sci-fi basically look lame. And novel enzymes. So we have new enzymes that can break down plastics without the chemicals. But we can use AI and are using artificial intelligence with companies like Google and DeepMind to produce new enzymes in 2 hours. So this is something that I suggest keeping on top of, because increasingly we're looking at new ways to use biology to replace chemistry at a very high level. And when we have a look at chemistry, we've got new catalysts that accelerate depolymerization. When we have a look at solvents, again, solvents are coming in the, should we say, into the view of a lot of governments and regulators, because they can be toxic, they can be damaging to the environment, and they can be difficult to manage. They have health and safety issues and so on and so forth. So, especially in Europe, we're seeing the development of plant-based solvents. And plant-based solvents are generally friendlier, if not even friendly, to the environment. Then when we have a look at mechanical, when we have a look at things like eddy current separators, we can use artificial intelligence to rapidly switch the magnetic field in an eddy current generator so that it more accurately sorts your non-ferrous materials. So AI is even operating or able to operate at this level. And then finally, when we have a look at scrap metal recycling, when we have a look at electrometallic, we've got new coatings, so new electrode coatings, to make everything more durable and more resilient. So it just frankly lasts longer. But these are things like new composites, new ceramics. So we have new technologies to extend the life, basically, of your electrodes. We've got new electrode shapes. So not only are these longer lasting, but they also carry more electricity because we are 3D printing electrodes now, which have massive surface areas, which means that we can take a giant battery or a giant system and condense it down into something much, much smaller. When we have a look at artificial intelligence again, it's incredibly good at making sure that the temperatures and the voltages are just right. And then we have hybrid innovation. Increasingly, this is where we see electro basically starting to come together, basically with ion exchange, membrane separation, precipitation, and solvent extraction. So increasingly, we're sort of taking one thing, we're starting to merge it together. When we have a look at hydrometallic, we've got new ionic liquids, which again can recover metals faster. And when we have a look at the solvent extraction process, we have new extractants. And these extractants are perfectly tailored to getting metals basically out of things faster. And then finally, pyrometallic. We're finding new ways, we're finding new reductants. So as opposed to using coke, increasingly we have new ways basically to use biomass, which is going to be a conversation on the environment again, or hydrogen as a pyroreductant. And then we've got new additives and new fluxes. So when we have a look at the things that are coming together to affect the industry, it's not one thing, it's not 10 things, it's hundreds of different things. But the opportunity for the recycling industry has always been there, but it has never been greater than it is today. Governments are waking up, like really waking up, to the value of your industry because of resource scarcity, because of the circular economy, because of ESG. And you don't just actually have consumers and governments on your side, you've even got the investors on your side. So hopefully you enjoyed not recycling this future, but hopefully you enjoyed the presentation, and I think we've got time for some questions. There you go, thank you. Behind you, there we go. Yeah, there's Mike over there.
Matthew, I think we're already in the future and we're very enthusiastic and eager to go forward. This is Dr. Salam Sharif. I'm the former chairman of BIR committee and founding chairman for Recycling Association of Africa. My question is, considering the carbon emissions and how we have challenges and how we can mitigate, and as we do a lot of hard work, but we don't get credit for it.
Yep.
Does AI has been geared up in measuring out the baselines of the existing carbon emissions as a baseline, and whether it can help in measuring out the reductions so that we can give all the recyclers out here some credit to move forward. The second question, if I may, while I'm at it, not to be a pessimist, but how would your intake be on the future of AI and technology in job displacement and cybersecurities?
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. So thank you for the question. So the first one is, when we have a look at trying to establish baselines for emissions using artificial intelligence, the biggest problem that we actually have when we're trying to craft baselines in terms of this is what we're using, and for example, this is what we can save you using our industry, is data. Now, when we have a look at data sources, the data sources are all over the place. Now, that's one of the things that I saw. For example, when we talk about hard waste and resource consumption, we have international governing bodies that say, we go to each country and we will require them to tell us how much waste they're producing. And these governments all have reporting processes, and they'll say, we're using this, and then it all gets added up at the top. When we have a look at the recycling industry broadly, I don't think there is that same level of aggregation. You know, when you have a look at World Bank, when you have a look at OECD, how many of those global institutions are coming to you and saying, how much product are your members recycling? And you say this. Now, when we talk about creating a baseline, the problem is still the same. It's reporting, because we don't have particular standards for reporting. Most organizations underreport or don't want to report, for greenwashing purposes. We saw a massive realignment of ESG stocks because the US EPA reclassified what they meant by sustainability. And all of a sudden, half of the stocks that had been invested in didn't meet the new criteria. So we have a problem getting together global data sets that we have confidence in, that we're able to aggregate to say this is where we are today. So that's a problem creating the baseline data gap. When we talk about things like job displacement, AI is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, artificial intelligence can automate. But on the other hand, it can also augment and level up. So one of my clients is Accenture. They automated 17,000 positions, but didn't make anyone redundant because they said these positions are going to be made redundant. These are the jobs of the future, and they just transitioned. They put in learning and development pathways in place that meant that these people who were going to lose their jobs in 2 years' time were able to transition to new jobs. When we have a look at robotics, for example, it's fairly similar. So in the UK, we have Ocado, and Ocado have got robots that pick goods, warehouse robots. And they've said to the people, in 5 years' time, you will all be replaced by robots. Okay? So if you have a look at some of your own workers, you can see the advancement of robotics, and you know that some of your workers are going to be automated, whether it's the back office or the front of house. But in Ocado's case, they're saying you're going to be replaced by a robot. We've got two choices. You can be made redundant, and we'll give you a bit of a paycheck, 3 months' salary, and bye-bye, good luck in the future. Or we can retrain you, starting today, to look after these robots, and we will pay you double to triple the salary. So when we have a look at job And you're right in the term, it's job displacement. So a lot of people talk in terms of job automation. We're just displacing this job here, and if we know what these jobs are over here in the future, the ones that we value, this middle bit here is learning and development. And those learning and development programs right now, we've shown in real big companies that we don't have to make people redundant because we can retrain them. So does that help? Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
The word waste.
Yeah.
Nobody calls gold waste. Nobody
No.
calls silver waste. Copper, aluminum, iron,
Yep.
stainless, they're all commodities.
Yep.
I'm on a journey to try to change that narrative.
Yep.
But it's just waste is thrown at us and it becomes, how do we change it?
Yeah.
Because it's not waste when it's a commodity.
Exactly. Okay. So Susie and I were having this little bit of a chat before. So when you have a look, so there's this kind of similarity, when you have a look at the say the scrap metal yards, or the recycling yards that you have, whether it's plastics or fabric, whatever, metals. Yeah, you look at these images and it's just a mess of material, right? People have sort of, but people have come in basically and people have just dumped. If you have a look at landfills, you've got a huge mix of material. Yeah. When we're digging ore out of the ground, it's exactly the same problem. When we're digging the stuff out of the ground, we look at ore and say, there's a huge amount of dirt in there. I just want this little bit. But I've got all this junk here that I don't want. Now, I absolutely agree. So I think that the word waste is actually a cultural bias. Because in the past, 100 years ago, we would use something, we'd put it in the bin, it would go to landfill, and the landfill was waste. Okay? However, 75 years plus ago, we were able to use a product, put it into a recycling system, and then get a new product out. That's not actually the same definition of waste for a start. Okay. So firstly, I agree, as an industry, you're not dealing with waste. 100 years ago, the people in landfills were dealing with waste. You aren't dealing with waste. You are dealing with resource. But here's the thing. So it's a messaging. So what you have is you actually have a marketing problem, I would say. And the reason I would say that, so on the one hand, you've got a marketing problem because when people say, let's welcome you, we're going to be talking about the future of waste, you go, no, future of resource, okay? So as an industry, you've got to correct everybody. However, when I was putting this presentation together, I was actually looking at lots of different recycling companies. Do you know how many recycling companies on their front website basically say, we recycle waste? Waste recyclers. The waste that we recycle is plastic. So actually, as an industry, if you want to move away from the word waste and actually have the word resource replace it, a lot of your own members are saying, we are waste recyclers. No, you're not. You're resource recyclers. So this is why I ironically say, basically, it's actually what you have is a marketing message. So do a quick Control-Alt-F, find the word waste in on all your websites, your materials, your reports, replace it with resource. And then when the governments say, we're going to be talking about waste, no. Resource. But if you're not pushing back, in 10 years' time, we'll still be going, so let's talk about the future of waste recycling. And also, it's doing you a disservice, because calling it waste, I look at it and go, oh, you recycled my waste. It's a low-value product. I don't care about it. It's a commodity. Waste. Whereas if you are recycling resources, how many governments do you think care about resources? All of them. Remarket yourselves.
Just to add on this, I find it quite ironic that governments, some part of the governments continue to categorize us as waste, whereas at the same time they look at what we produce and start to believe it's critical raw materials and strategic raw materials. Doesn't make any sense to me. So we have to change that mindset as well.
Well, so here's an example. So give me a quick example, okay? You go to a government and you say, did you know that, say, as the EU or the Middle East, we're exporting a huge amount of waste to, say, the Philippines? Now, what do you think the governments are going to do? The government's basically, in their heads, the people you're talking to are like, good, because I don't want waste in my backyard, okay? So they sort of go, I'd rather the Philippines have it, Did I say that on camera? No, can't get me. Okay, now try this, but now the mindset matters. Have this conversation, go, it's unbelievable. Did you know how much resource you're exporting to the Philippines? What do you mean resource? Are you talking about the waste? No, resource. You're exporting a huge amount of resource to the Philippines. Oh, hang on, I care about resource. One word or two words, very different mindset. Marketing issue still.
Hello, this is Rajesh Agarwal from RKG International. You very rightly talked about the marketing and the word resource. This is our industry problem now, because the waste, recycle and scrap word, and we all are talking in all our meetings, including Israel, BIR, BMR, anywhere. And when you talked about the marketing, the word, can you suggest us, because you seem to be encyclopedia on this issue, can you suggest us one or two tool of marketing so that we may think of what we want to do? Thank you.
Okay. So the first thing I would suggest you do is what we call an oncology, terminology, that sort of stuff. So really, from the BIR, I would suggest you have a communications policy document, which is then fed to every member. And in that policy document, there is almost a paragraph on how we as an industry message ourselves. So firstly, you develop a standard messaging system. So you develop a standard way of messaging. And that can either be done at an individual company level, but it's generally done better at a sort of consortium level. So as a BIR, basically, or as a group of companies coming together, you say, from now on, we are going to use this terminology. Okay, it's not just swap waste for resource, but as an industry, we are going to use this terminology. And things like, it's not waste, it's resource. It's green. It's helping the planet. You see where I'm going? So you have almost really a marketing brochure, marketing guidelines, which is not really going to be in your natural wheelhouse, because you say, I run this company, we aren't really a marketing company. But actually you are a marketing company, because you're trying to sell not only your industry, but your own products and services and what it is that you actually do. So that's the first thing. Standardize the message for the industry. Secondly, go to the press, but also go to governments and say, this is how we communicate. We no longer talk in terms of waste. We talk in terms of recycling resource. And then you cascade. So that's where you start.
So actually, Matthew, this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
But it's a long road. It takes time to change the wording, the narrative, the story, and the mindset. But this is exactly what the industry is doing today.
Yeah. So It can take a long time. However, when did you start the process?
To change the narrative? Well, a long time ago, but it's more structured.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So that's the thing. So firstly, it needs to be structured. Almost needs to be officially, as an industry, this is how we will message and market ourselves going forward. However, if you've also been doing it for a long time, I still come across a huge number. You know where I'm going with this. You can go to recycling. So if you go to any of the recycling publications, for example, who are absolutely ground zero basically for your industry, count the number of times they say waste on their front page today, not 10 years ago. Have a look at your members' websites, and there's still waste there. So this is almost where there's that. It's like consumers. We're trying to change behaviours, and it is difficult, and it does take a long time. But this is almost where you could have a department basically that helps. But it's even when the press are talking about it. I mean, you all know basically that it's easier for me to find information about waste than resource recycling, right? It's going to be like that iceberg where 95% of all of the material that's produced will say waste, not resource. But so it does take a long time, but this is where I think almost what I see is sometimes a firm hand saying, this is in our industry. This is in our industry's benefit. As an industry, we shouldn't be doing this. We must be doing this because it's important for the planet, it's important for the industry, it's important for consumers. But it's difficult.
Yeah, Matthew, just dwell on the same line of thoughts here. It's not a question, it's an important comment here. I'll make it quick. It looks like in 1989, some resource ignorant came into Basel, Switzerland, and articulated the definition of our raw material as waste. And in 1992, 20 countries have gathered up and echo-sounded what he has declared, and the guy has absconded. Until now, we're trying to figure out how to change the waste into raw material or resource, and we're still doing the same job.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
No, absolutely. And I say it across industries, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to change the perception of your entire industry, but you are also trying to change the words that almost everybody uses. Basically, so when we talked about, so that slide I had up, we talk about mass education, where everybody knows that we should be, everyone knows we should recycle, right? Almost everyone on the planet knows we should recycle. And yet, behaviours still mean that 15% of plastic's recycled, or whatever it happens to be. But if as an industry you are standing shoulder to shoulder, and every time, even in a meeting, someone says, let's discuss waste, and you say, no, it's resource, and let me explain why it's resource, even in the private meetings, not just at the EU level or whatever. You say, no, it's resource, and the reason it's resource is because, for example, this plastic contains oil, and we can take that oil back out and put it back into the economy. As an industry, you have to stand shoulder to shoulder on the messaging. That's the only way that you're going to start changing it. When you get the press proofs through and they say, today we were talking about the future of waste, every single time it's mentioned, you go, no, correct that, it's not waste, it's resource. It's a real pain in the butt, to be honest, but from what I see with other industries and everything else, every time someone says the word waste, you go, just excuse me, no. Resource, every time. Because you let it slip once, then the front page will have future of waste on it again, or whatever it happens to be. There you go. Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Matthew. That was amazing.
You're welcome.
There's a present on the stage, a little present for you.
Thank you. Is it recyclable?
Yeah. Please, everyone, join me in a round of applause for Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.